This lecture will cover the War of Spanish Succession and the series of peace treaties known as the Peace of Utrecht. So, what is the War of Spanish Succession? It's an interesting and really influential war that is not discussed as prominently as it should be, most likely. This war and its treaty are the main reason why Great Britain will get as powerful as it does in the future. So, why was this fought? Well, it all had to do with who was succeeding or coming next on the throne in Spain. Charles II of Spain was going to die without an heir. So, of course, in his will, he stipulated who should come next, and he said that his successor should be Louis XIV's grandson, Philip. The reason for this is that Louis XIV had married a Spanish princess, so Philip was technically in the bloodline, and Louis's son had died, so he's not really a choice. So when Charles died and Philip moved to take the throne in Spain, Europe panicked. This would totally disrupt the balance of power. Since Louis XIV's grandson is also Louis XIV's heir, he would probably become the King of France too. So of course any Protestant, or I guess any European country, could see what the possibility was. Philip could unite both crowns. He could make a mega France-Spain combo country that would be incredibly Catholic. That was really, really threatening to nations like Great Britain or some of the newer Protestant countries. Queen Anne was on the throne in England, and we'll talk more about her later, and of course that's threatening to her power because so far she hadn't produced an heir. So of course Great Britain, as well as Sardinia, Savoy, which are places in the former Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, and the Netherlands all got involved to fight against France and Spain together. Unfortunately for France and Spain, they lost, and the result is known as the Peace of Utrecht. So, the Peace of Utrecht was signed in Utrecht, which is a city in the Netherlands, in 1713. A few basic things were decided. It was a super complex treaty, but we're only going to talk about the small or the big ticket items. First, Louis XIV's grandson Philip was allowed to be King of Spain, now called Philip V. However, Philip had to renounce for himself and any of his descendants any right to the French throne. No mega country for him. That left Louis XIV with one heir left in his direct bloodline. He had a few other possibilities, but the one heir in his direct bloodline was his great-grandson, also called Louis, who would eventually be Louis XV. This was a big deal, because at the signing of this treaty, Louis, the eventual 15th, was only 3 years old. Now, Louis doesn't know he's going to die within 2 years, but this would eventually lead to a ton of instability for France in the future, since he's not really going to be ruling at age 5, but instead will have regents controlling the throne. And of course, hindsight's 20/20, but those regents were really terrible leaders. The second big thing was that Spain and France had to give up a bunch of their land and territories up to the winners. First, Britain got Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and other Canadian land from France, so this is the point where they begin to control Canada more substantially. Then, they got this thing known as the Asiento. The Asiento was basically a monopoly on the trading of slaves from Africa to the Spanish colonies in the New World. Spain, of course, had it because they controlled the ports of sale along the African coast, as well as the ports of entry in the New World. They gave this contract, which is what Asiento actually means. It's more of a generic term. It's just in history we really refer to this specific thing. They had to give this thing to the British because they really didn't have much else to give. They could give a few islands, which they did, in the Caribbean, but that was pretty much it. So what this treaty ends up really being about is giving Britain mountains of money and tons of new territory at the expense of France and Spain, who will start to decline. Well, Spain is already in decline, and France will stay powerful. I mean, we haven't even seen Napoleon yet, but what you see is the rise of England and Great Britain as a new superpower as a result of this, because the Asiento made them very rich and, of course, weakened Spain. So Spain is going to decline even more since they lost the Asiento, because it was a huge moneymaker for them. So do you see why this was so important, despite the fact that they don't really talk about it in your book? Lastly, within 2 years of this treaty with Britain, Louis XIV died. His death portrait is the picture here. Of course, he had a death portrait, since everything in his life was a show. You can see him sitting in his bed with his great-grandson Louis next to him. So here's Louis XIV, and then there is Louis XV, well, eventual 15th once he died. He was talking to him, and so what's recorded as his, supposed final last words are, "You will be king of a great kingdom. I urge you to never forget your obligations to God. Remember that you owe him everything. him being God, because of course he's Catholic. Try to remain at peace with your neighbors. I have loved war too much. Do not copy me in that or in my overspending. Take advice in everything. Try to find out the best course and always follow it. Lighten your people's burden as soon as possible, and do what I have had the misfortune not to do myself. I find this very interesting, number one, because, of course, this is just recorded last words. He may not have said all of that. But I do think it's interesting because he was so adamant about his absolute power and his spending and creating Versailles and all of his earlier wars that gave him territory. It looks like at the end of his life he finally realized the damage he had done, but it was kind of too late to do anything about it. Also, do you really think his 5-year-old great-grandson is actually listening to this advice? Probably not. And there's not any regents in the room, so this kind of falls on nobody's ears. So overall, Louis kind of died with a beautiful palace and absolute rule, power beyond measure, but at what cost? It cost France a lot in the long run.